Grief Lessons, What We Should Have Been Taught. Part 1, The Lesson Left Out, Why Society Avoids Grief and Why We Can't Anymore. Chapter 1, The Class That Was Never Scheduled. The first time I encountered death, I was 8 years old. My uncle, a man of boundless energy and irreverent humor, had been in an accident. One day he was there, laughing, teasing, ruffling my hair, and the next he was not. There was no explanation offered. Only hurried whispers in the house, an unusual hush in the air, and an unfamiliar tension in my parents' eyes. At the funeral, I was told to sit quietly. No one explained why my uncle's body was in a box, or why the adults around me alternated between tight smiles and sudden, shuddering sobs. When I asked my mother if Uncle Sam would wake up soon, she patted my hand and said, "Don't worry, sweetheart. He's sleeping." But he wasn't. I knew it then, in the way children know things no one says. What I didn't know was how to make sense of it. I carried my questions and confusion home, alone. No one at school spoke of it. No teacher asked if I was all right. No book explained what death meant, or what to do with the strange mix of sadness, fear, and numbness curling in my chest. I learned two things in those days. First, that grief was something adults handled behind closed doors. Second, that children were expected to return to normal, even when nothing felt normal. Years later, as a parent and educator, I realized something even more troubling. My experience was not unique. In fact, it was universal. In most modern school systems, grief is not on the syllabus. There are no lessons on what loss is, how it affects us, or how to navigate its rocky terrain. We prepare children for algebra, ancient history, and the life cycle of a butterfly, but not for the death of a parent, a friend, or even a beloved pet. We teach them the periodic table, but leave them unequipped for life's most inevitable experience. Loss. Why is this? Part of it lies in cultural discomfort. Western societies in particular have long treated grief as a private matter. Death itself is sanitized, medicalized, and often hidden away. Grief, when it does emerge, is expected to be brief, managed, and invisible, an aberration in the otherwise productive rhythm of life. Children, meanwhile, are perceived as too fragile for such conversations. Well-meaning adults often shield them from death, offering euphemisms instead of truth and distractions instead of space for mourning. The result? Children absorb grief alone, without language, validation, or guidance. Yet grief will come. It always does. By the time they turn 18, an estimated 1 in 14 children in the United States will experience the death of a parent or sibling. Globally, the numbers are higher still, especially in communities affected by war, disease, or natural disaster. Beyond death, children also face grief through divorce, estrangement, migration, or the loss of stability and safety. And when grief comes, unspoken and unaddressed, it leaves scars. Numerous studies have linked unprocessed childhood grief to increased risks of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, academic struggles, and even chronic illness later in life. Trauma, at its core, is often grief that has been left unsupported. Imagine if this were true of another universal life event. Say puberty. What if we never taught children about the physical and emotional changes they would experience? What if we left them to navigate those changes alone, without education or empathy? We would call it malpractice. Yet this is precisely what we do with grief. There are exceptions, of course. A handful of schools, often in the wake of tragedy, have begun to integrate grief support programs. In New Zealand, some educators use Maori practices of collective mourning to teach students about grief as a communal process. In Scandinavian countries, death education is occasionally woven into broader discussions of life and ethics, but these efforts remain rare and fragmented. In most classrooms, grief is absent, not because teachers do not care, but because they are unprepared. Few teacher training programs include grief education. Most school curricula make no room for it. And so, when loss touches a student's life, as it inevitably will, educators are left to improvise. This gap in our educational system reflects a larger cultural denial. In societies obsessed with youth, success, and positivity, grief is viewed as an unwelcome shadow. We fear that speaking of it will burden children or invite despair. In reality, the opposite is true. Children are astute observers of life's complexities. They notice when someone is missing. They feel the shifts in adult behavior. They experience loss in ways as profound as any adult, albeit with different expressions and needs. When we deny them language and space for grief, we do not protect them, we isolate them. Teaching grief is not about imposing sorrow. It is about equipping children with tools, the language to name their feelings, the understanding that grief is natural, the permission to mourn, and the awareness that they are not alone. It is also about teaching life's deepest truths, that love and loss are intertwined, that resilience includes vulnerability, and that empathy begins with the recognition of shared human experiences. Integrating grief education into schools does not require dismantling existing curricula. It can be woven through literature, history, art, and health education. It can be supported through teacher training and community partnerships. It can be as simple as creating spaces where grief is acknowledged, honored, and explored. But first, it must be scheduled. It must be seen not as an optional topic for moments of crisis, but as an essential lesson for life. Grief will touch every student in every school. The only question is whether we will leave them to face it in silence or prepare them to meet it with understanding and support. As I reflect on my 8-year-old self at that funeral, bewildered and alone, I wonder how different my path might have been if someone had pulled up a chair in the classroom and said, "Today, we are going to talk about grief. It is part of life. You are allowed to feel it, and you will not face it alone." It is time for that lesson to begin. Chapter 2, Universal Experience, Unprepared Lives. When Maya lost her father in a car accident at age 9, no one at school mentioned it. The Monday after the funeral, she returned to her 4th grade classroom as if nothing had happened, because no one seemed willing to acknowledge that something had. During recess, her teacher gently advised, "It might help to stay busy." A classmate whispered, "Don't cry, your dad wouldn't want you to be sad." The school counselor offered a stack of grief coloring pages without a conversation. At home, Maya cried alone at night, clutching a stuffed bear. During the day, she learned that grief was something to hide. Maya's story is not an exception. It is the norm. Grief touches every life. Yet in schools around the world, it remains largely invisible. The most universal human experience, loss, is the one for which we least prepare children. The numbers are staggering. In the United States alone, 1 in 14 children will lose a parent or sibling before the age of 18. That translates to nearly 5 million bereaved children. And this does not include the countless others who grieve grandparents, friends, teachers, or the loss of stability through divorce, foster care, migration, or trauma. Globally, the reach of childhood grief is even wider. According to UNICEF, over 200 million children worldwide have lost one or both parents. In regions affected by conflict, natural disaster, or epidemic disease, rates of childhood bereavement are exponentially higher, and death is only part of the story. Modern childhood is marked by other profound forms of loss: displacement through war or climate crisis, separation from caregivers through incarceration or migration, loss of community through violence or gentrification, loss of health through illness or disability. Each of these experiences carries its own grief, even if it is not always named as such. What happens when this grief goes unaddressed? A growing body of research paints a sobering picture. Bereaved children without adequate support face a significantly elevated risk of depression and anxiety, post-traumatic stress, substance misuse, academic difficulties, social withdrawal, increased likelihood of chronic physical illness. One landmark study from the UK-based Childhood Bereavement Network found that bereaved children are more than twice as likely to exhibit behavioral problems at school. Another study published in Pediatrics Journal revealed that unresolved grief is a key predictor of adolescent suicide attempts. And yet most schools are not prepared to intervene. In a 2022 survey by the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement, only 10% of U.S. schools reported having a formal grief support program. In many schools, grief is addressed only reactively, when a death occurs within the school community, and even then, responses are often improvised, inconsistent, and short-term. Educators, for the most part, receive little to no training in how to support grieving students. Teachers report feeling unequipped to have conversations about death or loss, fearing that they might say the wrong thing or exacerbate a child's pain. Administrators, navigating competing curricular demands and systemic pressures, often relegate grief to the margins. The result is a hidden epidemic. Children grieve in silence, carrying burdens they do not know how to name. Consider Jacob, a soft-spoken middle schooler whose mother died from cancer. His grades plummeted. He lashed out in class. One teacher commented in a disciplinary note, "Jacob is seeking attention." In truth, he was seeking acknowledgement. His world had been upended, yet no one at school had asked how he was coping. Or Amina, a teenager in Nairobi whose family was displaced by drought and violence. At her new school, no one spoke of what she had lost: her home, her friends, her familiar life. "Here," she told a local counselor, "I am expected to smile and be grateful, but inside I am full of grief." Stories like Maya's, Jacob's, and Amina's repeat in classrooms across every continent. Grief is the undercurrent beneath behavioral struggles, absenteeism, disengagement, and even violence. Yet because we do not teach grief, we fail to recognize its signs or address its roots. By contrast, where grief literacy is prioritized, the outcomes shift dramatically. In Norway, a national initiative integrates grief education into the broader life skills curriculum. Students learn about the emotions of loss, practice expressing them through art and dialogue, and participate in community rituals of remembrance. Schools collaborate with local bereavement organizations, ensuring that students and teachers alike have access to training and support. In one Norwegian district affected by a mass shooting, grief education became a cornerstone of the recovery process. Teachers reported that students not only developed healthier coping mechanisms, but also demonstrated increased empathy and community cohesion in the years that followed. Similar initiatives in parts of Japan, New Zealand, and Finland underscore a key truth. When grief is named, honored, and taught, children build resilience. They learn that grief is not a problem to fix or a weakness to hide, but a part of life and of love that can be met with courage and compassion. The evidence is clear. Grief is universal. Preparation is not. This mismatch costs children dearly. Imagine instead if we approached grief as we do literacy or numeracy, a foundational life skill to be nurtured from an early age. Imagine if children learned how to recognize grief in themselves and others, how to express grief safely and authentically, how to support peers who are grieving, how to understand cultural and personal differences in mourning, how to access help when needed. Such an education would not shield children from loss. Nothing can. But it would offer them a map through the territory of grief, a language, a community, a path. It would also offer our societies something desperately needed: generations of citizens equipped to meet each other's sorrows with empathy rather than avoidance. The statistics remind us that grief is coming to every classroom and every child. The question is not if, but when, and whether we will choose to meet that inevitability with preparation or with silence. For Maya, for Jacob, for Amina, and for the millions of children walking through unspoken grief today, it is time to answer that question with action. The classroom for grief is overdue. The lessons must begin now. Chapter 3: The Global Grief Gap: How Other Cultures Teach Grief. I sat in a sunlit courtyard in Oaxaca, Mexico, watching a family build a vibrant altar of marigolds, candles, and framed photographs. The Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, was approaching. Around me, children painted skull masks in brilliant colors, while elders prepared offerings of sweet bread and tamales. There was laughter, music, and the scent of incense thick in the air. "This is how we teach the children," my host, Anna, told me. "We do not hide death from them. We welcome it into life. They grow up knowing that love does not end, and that remembering is an act of joy." It was a scene that stood in sharp contrast to the hushed funerals of my own childhood. Here, grief was not a private burden. It was a shared, communal expression woven into the cultural fabric. A space where children learned not only how to mourn, but how to celebrate memory. In much of the Western world, we shield children from grief. In many other cultures, they are taught to live with it. This difference matters. Across the globe, grief education takes many forms. In some societies, it is an explicit part of the curriculum. In others, it is embedded in ritual, story, and community life. Where it is present, children develop a healthier relationship with loss. Where it is absent, grief becomes a lonely shadow. Consider Japan, where the Buddhist concept of impermanence, that all things are transient, is taught from a young age. In many Japanese schools, students participate in ceremonies that honor the dead, both within their families and in the broader community. Lessons on life cycles and the natural flow of existence are integrated into early education. As a result, children learn to accept loss not as a personal failure or abnormal event, but as an integral part of the human experience. In parts of New Zealand, Maori traditions offer another powerful model. The Maori concept of wakawanangatanga, the building of relationships, extends to the ancestors. Death is not a rupture but a continuation of connection. In Maori schools, children are often taught to speak to their ancestors, to acknowledge them in ceremonies, and to understand grief as both individual and collective. When a student or teacher dies, it is customary for the entire school community to gather on the marae, meeting grounds, to mourn together. Children are encouraged to express their emotions openly, supported by the collective strength of the group. Contrast this with the typical response in Western schools. When a student dies, there may be a brief announcement or a moment of silence, followed by an unspoken expectation that life will quickly return to normal. Grief, if acknowledged at all, is treated as a temporary disturbance rather than an ongoing process. Teachers lacking training may avoid the topic altogether, leaving students to process complex emotions in isolation. The gap is not merely cultural, it is also educational. In Finland, grief education is included in the national curriculum under the umbrella of emotional and social learning. From primary school onward, students explore themes of loss, change, and coping through literature, discussion, and creative expression. Teachers receive professional development on supporting grieving students, and schools partner with bereavement organizations to ensure access to resources. Research from Finnish schools shows that this approach fosters not only healthier grief processing, but also greater empathy and resilience among students. One principal told me, "When our children encounter loss later in life, they already have a framework for understanding it. They know it is natural. They know how to ask for help." Such frameworks are rare in most education systems. The global grief gap is not just a matter of whether grief is addressed, but how, and whether it is framed as a universal, shared human experience or as a private, pathologized event. In Ghana, traditional funeral practices often span several days, with children actively involved in ceremonies that honor the deceased and celebrate life. Through storytelling, dance, and communal rituals, grief is demystified. Children witness mourning as part of the life cycle, learning that grief can coexist with gratitude and even joy. In stark contrast, many Western families and schools exclude children from funerals, fearing the experience will be too distressing. Yet studies suggest the opposite. Children who are given age-appropriate explanations and allowed to participate in mourning rituals report lower levels of anxiety and confusion and develop a more coherent understanding of death. The global grief gap is also shaped by socioeconomic and political factors. In countries experiencing prolonged conflict or displacement, grief is often a daily reality. In Syrian refugee camps, for example, educators and aid workers have had to develop ad hoc grief education programs to help children cope with pervasive loss. Using art therapy, storytelling, and group dialogue, they create spaces where grief can be expressed safely, a vital counter to the trauma of silence. The lessons from these diverse contexts are clear. Children are capable of engaging with grief when it is presented with honesty and compassion. Ritual, story, and community are powerful tools for teaching grief. And silence breeds fear and isolation. Dialogue fosters resilience and connection. If we are to bridge the global grief gap, Western education systems must move beyond reactive, crisis-driven responses. Grief literacy should be woven into the fabric of schooling, from early childhood through adolescence. It should be culturally inclusive, recognizing that there is no single right way to grieve, and that honoring diverse mourning practices enriches the educational experience for all students. Imagine a classroom where a child learns not only about the water cycle or quadratic equations, but also about the cycle of life and loss. Where students read stories that explore grief with honesty. Where teachers are equipped to guide conversations about mourning. Where rituals of remembrance are part of school culture. Where no child feels alone in their sorrow. Such classrooms exist in Oaxaca, in Japanese temples, in Maori marae, in Finnish schools, in Ghanaian villages. The wisdom is there. The models are there. What is needed now is the will to learn from them. As I left that courtyard in Oaxaca, marigolds shimmering in the late afternoon sun, I thought of Anna's words. We do not hide death from them. We welcome it into life. Perhaps this is the most profound lesson of all, that grief, when embraced as a teacher rather than feared as an enemy, can become a source of connection, compassion, and enduring strength. It is time we began that lesson everywhere.